Hi, everybody. Here we are now with the Post-Impressionist movement. So not a great definition, really, or a name that has an easily defined set of rules. Post just means after, right? So this is a group of artists who became prominent after the Impressionists had kind of had their day in the sun. So if we think of Impressionism sort of kicking off with the Salon de Refusé, 1863, they showed together until about 86. We're looking at the late 80s into the turn of the century as the heyday of the Post-Impressionists. They don't all have the same style. The Impressionists are a little closer together in style. They either look kind of like Monet or kind of like Degas. The Post-Impressionists, on the other hand, are going to forge this idea that each artist has his or her own unique individual vision, and that's what it really is all about. Now, Cezanne, Seurat, Gogh, all of the artists that were in that list were actually in exhibitions with the Impressionists early on and then moved away from that. So we talked about that group being a little fluid earlier. Here are some people who kind of moved away from it. So today we're going to take a look at Cezanne, Seurat, who created the style that he called divisionism, that we refer to as pointillism. Then, of course, a couple giants there, Gauguin and Van Gogh. And that's the last time I'm going to pronounce it properly. Gogh is apparently the right way to say it, but we all say Van Gogh, so forgive me for that. But these are artists whose names you've heard of before, I think, and that you're going to enjoy. Cezanne, a piece to know for the test right off the bat, this is one of several paintings that he did of Mount Sainte-Victoire. The painting is obviously a little bit similar to the Impressionist movement in that you can see the brushstrokes. But don't the brushstrokes look bigger to you? Don't they look a little blockier, a little more rectangular or square? Cezanne was an artist who initially trained to work in law and in fact came to art a little bit later. So he's breaking the rules of what the academy would do in terms of training. He was one of the artists who was included in the Salon de Refusé in 1863. He is forging out on his own terms. Now, subject matter wise, you're not going to find him as exciting as Vincent van Gogh, I'm sure. From a technical standpoint, though, I think it's kind of amazing to look at what he does. If you look at that image there, you can see there's a mouse. You see that dark green that's there in the sky right above the mountaintop is a very similar green to what's here in the trees, what's in the foreground. There are some blues that are also reflected in the ground, in the shadows on the building. Even some of the oranges make their way into mixtures in the sky. So what the artists of the Impressionist movement were really doing, that I think is kind of amazing, is they really were painting the effect of light on an object to your eye. Now, theoretically, when light hits an object, some wavelengths are absorbed and other wavelengths are reflected back to your eye. So if there are wavelengths bouncing off an object toward you, might that surface also reflect light in different directions? Wouldn't it make sense that a bit of the green of the grass might reflect into a house nearby the grass? Wouldn't it make sense if you look at it a little bit more deliberately than the way the Impressionists did it? Here we see it so physically evident. There are literally similar colors, if not the exact same colors, in the mountain as in the ground, in the grass, in the buildings, and in the sky. It's a technical tour de force of thought and technique. It may be the most exciting subject, but Cezanne paints these subjects like an Impressionist in a way, in that he does multiple images of the same subject, but he paints a mountain the same way he paints a still life. There's elements in here of reflected color in the wood that are the same as the colors in the fruit. There's elements of color in the fruit that are the same as colors in the wood around them. The other thing I think that's really great as work, and we saw this with Whistler a bit earlier, is that the color white is used fairly liberally here, you would think, until you actually put something white in that image. There's a stark white circle. And now suddenly nothing in that painting that looked like it was white is as purely bright as that. All of those whites are what my best painting professor, Bill Calme, used to call ish colors. That white is blue-ish, or green-ish, or orange-ish. There's a lot of mixture of color into those what otherwise would look to be plain colors like white or even gray. Just want to take that circle out for a moment and point out something else. Do you notice the table corner here pretty clearly? But if you look at the edge of the table going back, it doesn't actually line up properly with where the edge seems to be here. It's an odd thing that he sometimes does with perspective that you would call an error, but obviously is not something that jumps out to you instantaneously. So this is another aspect that separates the work from what the realists might do, even though it's quite obvious that he's looking at things in the real world to create his work. If we go back for a second to the painting of Victoire, we talked a little bit about the fact that the painting seems to be made up of squares, rectangular shapes of brushwork. But we also know that Cezanne referred to painting and drawing as having some basic forms, that everything in nature, he said, could be rendered as either a cube or a sphere or a cone. Now that first word, cube, is what Picasso is going to really laugh to. Really, truly, this painting and this type of work that Cezanne is doing is going to really, in part, inspire what Picasso and Georges Braque do in the 20th century, inventing Cubism. Kind of remarkable. This is the work of Georges Seurat. Now, you know Seurat from another painting that you'll see in a moment, a little bit more famous than this one. But if you look really closely at this surface, you can tell it's made up of little itty-bitty tiny little dots. So the paintings that you're seeing here fall into a style category. Georges Seurat really invented his own style. He called it divisionism. He was interested in physics, the way light could be broken into separate wavelengths of color through a prism. And so if you get really, really close to his painting, look at the details of them, you'll see that in areas that look green, there will be some green paint, of course, but also some areas of light yellow and blue side by side. This is what we call optical mixing. Your eye tends to mix these colors at a distance. In fact, his paintings almost look more realistic, more believable, more solid from further away than they do up close. One of the most famous of his paintings is this one, Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. La Grande Jatte means the large platter, and it was an island in the middle of a lake. It was sort of a park or a pleasure place that you could take a boat out to, enjoy the day, and then go back to your daily life. So you see in this painting that there's a lot of odd mixtures of different types of people from different walks of life. If you look at the foreground on the left-hand side, there's a man in a sleeveless shirt smoking a pipe, sitting only a few feet or maybe a couple yards away from a man in a top hat carrying a cane. It almost feels as if different social classes are mixing in these images. If you look at the woman at the far right with the large bustle in her dress, she's got a leash in her hand that you would think is for a dog. In fact, that's her pet monkey that you see right in front that's playing with a little dog. So there's kind of some humor in these. You can see the Impressionist style at a distance if you look at the leaves in the trees along the top edge of the painting. And the closer you get to these, the more you're going to see that that color is being generated by your eye mixing those yellows and blues and greens at a distance. It's kind of a remarkable painting. We know that a lot of artists who would later become stars of the Fauve movement, we'll see them in Unit 4, played around with this idea of broken dots of color and did their versions of pointillism or divisionism. These are paintings by Derain at the left, Vlaminck, and Marquet, but most importantly, Henri Matisse also practiced this idea of separating the colors by little dots. He didn't do it for a long period in his career, but this concept of Seurat has a very lasting impact. It really is a tribute to the idea of what an artist could do if the painting didn't have to look like a realistic depiction that had all tons of detail and looks like the way things are quote-unquote supposed to look. Well, we have cameras to do that, don't we? We have photography that can achieve that kind of goal. So maybe the camera could liberate painters to try other options. Some people, of course, are going to stick with more realistic approaches, but other artists are increasingly going to explore abstraction and self-expression. That brings us to Gauguin. Gauguin is definitely an artist who should probably, by his history, not have gone down this particular path. Gauguin initially had a job working, believe it or not, in the stock market. And one of the things that fueled his career was the invention of the telephone. Now that sounds a little insane, but Gauguin had a job running information back and forth from the floor of a stock exchange to different vendors. Once the telephone was invented, that job became obsolete. He had to move on to do other things. So he experimented with lots of different things. He tried Impressionist styles. You can see that at the left-hand side, before really beginning to explore his own unique vision, and that's what you see toward the right in the painting, The Vision After the Sermon, also known as Jacob Wrestling with the Angel from 1888. We know that Gauguin had a large family. We all know that he sent his wife and children back to live with her parents. He basically said, I'm going to be an artist, and I don't have time to run a household, and they stayed married, but he went off on his own. In fact, he eventually moved to Tahiti. He went on a trip for a couple of years, then relocated there permanently by 1895. So his career is one of pursuing his own vision and not necessarily being a great family. When he's painting in France, and that's what we're seeing here with The Vision After the Sermon, you see women in peasant garb. That's how they would have dressed at the time. But what they're seeing, intense, and what field of grass is red anywhere in the world? It's obviously an emotional use of color less than a real use of observable color from nature. They are so overcome by the power of the sermon they've just heard in church that they're seeing this vision of what the preacher has talked about playing out before them in the real world. So he definitely has this ability to tap into spiritual function of storytelling, but also an emotional function of the color. Now, once he permanently relocates to Tahiti, he really does have kind of a change in his subject matter. He begins to paint native, generally female figures more than male, more often than not nude. We know that he had a series of relationships with women on the islands. We know that he fathered children by some of them as well. So not necessarily someone that you might look to for moral guidance or advice about marriage, but in terms of advice about what art can do, this painting gives us some very good advice. The painting actually is structured kind of backward from the way we're used to reading things. Instead of from left to right, look at this one from right to left. You see birth, you see the vigor of middle age, youth to middle age in the center, and then you see age at the far right, far left-hand side. You can see an aging figure, perhaps near death. So the painting's title is interesting too. He called it, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? And his words about this painting when he was asked, what does it mean? Explanations and obvious symbols would give the canvas a sad reality, and the questions asked by the title would no longer be a poem. One of the things I love about this piece in particular, Gauguin in general, is that he's giving you permission to draw your own conclusions about it. A neoclassical painting has an agenda. It has a message and a story, and it's clear as can be. Those allegorical gestures going all the way back to the Baroque art of Poussin are very much what neoclassical is about. The Romantic style has a pretty clear agenda about its commentary on the world. This is open to interpretation, and that's increasingly what art is beginning to do as we move into the Post-Impressionist era. That brings us to your friend and mine, Vincent van Gogh. This is not a particularly typical Van Gogh painting. It's dull and dark, it's browns and greens, it's hideously ugly to some people's way of seeing. It is one that he struggled with for a long time. Van Gogh was not someone who came to art by an easy path. He tried a lot of different jobs, including a couple of attempts at being a preacher. At one point, he was even asked by his congregation to please quit, to leave, because he was too intense, too hellfire and brimstone. We know he had disastrous relationships. He was constantly falling in love with the wrong woman or an unavailable woman, whether it was somebody else's fiance or his own cousin. He would sometimes form these romantic attachments emotionally that just could not be lived out in the real world. My suspicion is that he may have suffered from mental health issues similar to bipolar disorder because of the extreme highs and lows that he went through and the frequency with which those would recur. Regardless of what drove him or what made him difficult to be with in terms of relationships or even in terms of a traditional working life, made him a really passionate artist. Once he established that art was going to be his mode of supporting himself, one of the things that's kind of fascinating is that for a time he tried working as an art dealer, and several members of the Van Gogh family, including his brother Theo, were art dealers. That meant that they were selling prints, paintings from gallery situations to decorate people's homes. And Van Gogh was just not good at it. Vincent was not terribly good at it, but he loved it and wanted to explore that. He struggled with drawing, and in fact, there are only a couple times in his career that he sought formal training. One of those occasions, he was actually told at the end of a preliminary course in drawing that his drawing was so poor that he would benefit from taking their remedial class that was aimed at children rather than at adults. So he often struggled with the figure. The proportions clearly are not perfect in this piece, but he really thought of this as a piece that would make him a master in the style of somebody like Goya, perhaps, or even further back to one of his heroes, Velázquez. If you think of Velázquez, Bodejon paintings, the eating houses, the humble people, that is something that really appealed to Van Gogh. He wanted to be an artist for the people more than anything else. His style, though, is again heavily influenced by these Japanese prints. On the left, you have a woodcut print by Hiroshige. On the right is the Van Gogh painting based from it, and you can see his embellishments and changes happening there pretty clearly. When it comes to the landscape, all of the drawing problems seem to just kind of disappear, and you get this fluid brushwork, this incredibly vivid movement of the brush through the clouds that unite the clouds to the color of the sky and imitate the shapes of the plants. You can almost feel the wind blowing through the wheat here and through those cypress trees. There's a fluidity and a movement in this composition that is just second to none. No one else was really painting like this. And so Van Gogh eventually discovers that by working pretty much by himself in nature, he gets a pretty secure level of stability for him. But he really also sought to create community among artists. He wanted to create a artist commune, and in fact at one point even did have Gauguin living with him for a very brief time, sharing a home so that they could make art together and kind of generate this new art in the world. Gauguin probably accepted the offer just to get closer to Theo, Vincent's brother, who could be of benefit to Gauguin as a dealer, more so than out of true friendship to Vincent. But at any rate, they did fall out, and it was during the time that Gauguin lived there that Vincent van Gogh actually did the damage to his ear that is so well known. I think that we often think of Van Gogh as a dark and sad figure, but when you look at paintings like this, you can feel the joy that he has in expressing the beauty of the world, and he does that in a way that no artist before had really done. The brushstrokes are not impressionist, longer and even more obvious in some respects. aspects. There's outline, fairly heavy line, that would not have existed in the kind of painting that Monet was interested in doing at all. But this incredibly rich, bright, beautiful, saturated sense of color is what he's best known for. The self-portraits gave him a chance to experiment with the figure, and the portrait at the bottom right shows the bandaged ear. So everyone knows the story of Van Gogh cut his ear off and gave it to a prostitute. Well, it's like maybe 20% accurate. What actually happened was that Van Gogh and Gauguin got into an argument, and weirdly enough, they were arguing about a famous court case about a serial killer. And to prove his point, Vincent was being overly passionate, arguing his point, and Gauguin decided to just leave the house, and he went off to his favorite brothel to see his favorite working girl. So Vincent was still angry and decided he could maybe prove his point by a kind of extreme act, and so he slashed the earlobe of one ear and went with it in his hand to the brothel. So you can imagine what he looked like. It's Christmas Eve, he's in the snow, there's blood everywhere, and he wants to give this to Gauguin, but of course they won't let him in, so he ends up giving like a box or container with the piece of ear to the bouncer at the door to the girl that he knows that Gauguin is with. So really the ear mutilation was aimed at Gauguin almost as kind of a, I'll show you how intense my opinions are and how much I stand by my convictions, I'm willing to hurt myself to prove my point, was really aimed more at the painter than it was at any female or romantic relationship in his life. The other thing that's kind of odd about it is, of course, it immediately causes Gauguin to leave. He's not going to live in that situation anymore. And so Vincent does go in and out of institutes for mental health care off and on during the rest of his life. Perhaps his most intensely colored piece that we've seen so far is this one, The Night Cafe. And these are Vincent's words about the painting. In my painting of the All-Night Cafe, I've tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, become crazy and criminal. I've tried to convey the sinister power of such a place. We know a lot about what Van Gogh thought about his paintings because of the letters he wrote to his brother Theo. And this painting definitely shows very typical Van Gogh aspects. There's intense acidic contrasting colors. That sickly green and red are complementary colors that kind of fight each other, with that acid yellow in between them kind of radiating from those gas lamps, creating almost a hallucinogenic effect. The light is really harsh, as you can tell from the shadow that's being cast under the billiard table. I've always kind of thought that billiard table looked like it was an animal or a monster, that it could walk on its own. It's kind of alive. And I've often wondered where the proprietor's legs and feet are. You should see them underneath the edge of the table, shouldn't you? They just kind of disappear. This is definitely late at night in the cafe. There's very few people there. These are the hardcore drinkers. These are people who don't seem to be enjoying the effect. They're suffering the depressant effect of whatever it is that they've been consuming. It is a sinister and an intense place. You can also see the paint is so thick. If you look especially in the chair seat here at the front, or in the rough floorboards right here, you can literally see the paint has been applied so thickly that it is even casting shadow from the light in the room as a photograph is being taken of the painting. That thick layer of paint, or the thick application of paint, we call impasto, I-M-P-A-S-T-O, as opposed to thin layers that we call glazing, G-L-A-Z-E. A glaze is a thin application of paint. Impasto is painting very, very thick. Here's that thick paint again with a completely different color palette, a joyful color palette. This is Van Gogh's bedroom in the home that he shared or hoped to share with several artists over the course of this art colony he wanted to found, but where he and Gauguin actually lived together for a time. This was his bed. He made paintings to decorate the house even before Gauguin got there. For sure you know this one. The Starry Night, right? One of his most passionate and beautiful paintings. When you talk about somebody who definitely had sadness in their lives, when you talk about someone who had mental health issues, who went in and out of care, who clearly at least attempted self-mutilation at times, it's easy to get bogged down in the sadness of the Van Gogh story, but take a second to look at it from another point of view. Even though there was sadness, when there's joy, there's so much joy. This image to me definitely feels like an image of hope, an image of the wonder of nature, the vastness of the sky over our heads, which implies a bigger universe. It's almost as if this entire image is pulsing with movement and with light, but it's doing it in a way that an impressionist would never have done. It's also doing it in a way that Gauguin wouldn't have done, and Seurat wouldn't have done, and Cezanne wouldn't have done. Only Van Gogh would paint quite like this. So you see each one of the post-impressionists is developing his or her own way of doing things. This, weirdly, is the only painting that we actually have a recorded artifact to prove the sale of during Vincent's lifetime, the one painting he actually sold during his life. How was he surviving if he wasn't selling paintings? Well, his brother was sending him money for supplies and food, etc., etc. Vincent and Theo had a very loving brotherly relationship, and it was what allowed Vincent to have this kind of extraordinary career as a painter, was because he did have essentially a patron in a way. But they both hoped that the work would sell. And in fact, his work was getting better and better reception from people, but not making the news. It wasn't being reviewed in journals. It wasn't being promoted terribly well. Sadly, just before Vincent died, he'd attracted the attention of a writer who eventually became rather influential for other artists in promoting their careers. And he was working on an article about Vincent's work when Vincent's life ended. This is the portrait of the last doctor, Dr. Gachet, who helped Vince, kind of an interesting counterpoint to the previous piece. The one that we know he sold, this one in the 90s was sold by Christie's auction house, and it garnered over $82 million. And that price has been exceeded even since then by Van Gogh, and by other paintings of his have sold for even higher sums. So it's remarkable to think that someone whose work is considered this valuable by our culture died without knowing that his work was ever going to be well respected at all. This is not the last piece, but one of his last pieces, and it's often used when we discuss the end of his life. Now, a lot of people believe that Vincent committed suicide, that he shot himself. There is a new-ish biography about Van Gogh, though, that does put some question marks beside that theory of suicide. For one, the wound, the gun wound, is in the stomach as opposed to in the head or in the chest. Male suicide tends to be, if it's by gun, as a shot to the head quick. So it's odd that the wound is in a place that would take longer and would be much more painful and would not be a fast method of removing yourself. So I tend to wonder if that in and of itself begins to make us question whether this was a choice that he made directly, or perhaps it was an accident. We know that there was a young boy and his family staying near where Vincent was living at the time. They were on essentially an extended vacation, and the son was obsessed with Wild West shows, with Billy the Kid style Wild West shows that were touring in Europe, and he was obsessed with guns and with dressing like a cowboy. We also know he taunted Vincent quite a bit. We also know that Vincent ordered a ton of paints and other art supplies right before this event happened. So that also implies that he had a plan to stick around longer. So there's a lot of question marks about how and why this happened, but the biggest one that really surprises me is the statement that he made to the police. At some point, Vincent is wounded by a gun out in the fields painting. He manages to find his way back to the hotel, where he manages to linger long enough for his to get there. He dies in Theo's arms, but before Theo can get there, he's interviewed by the police, and he emphasizes that no one else was involved, which seems an odd thing to me to go to that extreme, unless you're perhaps trying to protect someone who maybe was a witness, who maybe was there and observed it, or perhaps was the one who stole the gun from the hotel and was showing off, accidentally shot someone, and it might have ruined their life if that had been known. So I wonder if it isn't slightly within the realm of possibility that the whole end of his life is just a tragic mistake rather than a tragedy of suicide. Either way, it's clear that Vincent was not the happiest of people. We know that he hoped that the sadness would end, and that when his life ended, that the sadness would be gone. And he certainly made enough statements about that to kind of fuel that idea. Because the police believed that he was that he died by his own hand, he could not be buried in consecrated ground. The church wouldn't even allow them to use a hearse. They had to borrow one from another village. He was buried outside of the church, and ironically, Theo, his brother, died just a few months later. Now, the reason that we know so much about them is because of the letters that went back and forth, but also because of Theo's rather remarkable wife. Theo's wife, Jo, actually is the one who started showing Vincent's work in her home, essentially in salon, kind of like we saw back in the Baroque. She actually showed and sold the work there, and just within a handful of years after Vincent's death, he became a rather remarkable success. Vincent and Theo's graves, by the way, are covered in sunflowers, the flower that Vincent was best known for painting, which is kind of exciting, that those flowers still exist to this day. We know that at the funeral service, they actually put several of his paintings up around the coffin, and they covered the coffin itself in sunflowers. So an artist who had an incredible impact on the rest of art history, probably an artist who makes other people want to make art because of his unique vision. Vincent was a star all the way through. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see the level of fame that he definitely deserved. But certainly you all recognize the quality of his work. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about his life.